Hello and welcome to Opinions, friendly to seniors, and our opinions are our opinions, which we're giving out to you absolutely free of charge with Dr. Peter Zalan. Dr. Zalan, welcome to Opinions, and we're really going to be interested in what you have to say, your particular opinions, which you've been giving out for a number of years now. And of course, you're an anesthesiologist here in Sudbury at Health Sciences North, and also president of the medical staff as well. And you've held a number of other positions, ethics committee, also, well, you tell me.
Well, first, thank you for having me, and pleasure to be here. I write a monthly article on Northern Life to try to present issues of interest to the community with respect to health issues. And I'm involved with a LIM committee that's looking at healthcare delivery in our community.
And one of the things that has fascinated both you and I over the past little while is the number of people, especially older folks, who are interested in end of life. Another expression for death, I guess. But and of course, being an anesthesiologist, you're in an interesting position because you really put people to sleep all the time.
Well, it's more my work for 30 years as an intensive care physician.
Right.
In the operating room, we put people to sleep, but we like them all to wake up.
Yeah.
And so the issues of end of life don't really come up there. It's more in the intensive care unit where a number of individuals are near the end of life.
And of course, end of life means going to sleep for, well, basically forever. And
yes, if you look at it from that perspective, yes.
and this is something that really is beginning to resonate with not only older people but some younger people as well too, because end of life can occur really at any stage.
Yes, and I was very impressed. The Health Sciences North, together with community partners, put on 2 forums to talk about end of life issues, and in January and February. And together we had about 1,000 folks come. So I think there's great interest in the community on this issue.
Now, of course, people get sick, people get ill. And when you were involved with the critical care unit, you saw many instances of people who had illnesses and conditions that really led to end of life. And the situation, as we've mentioned in your articles and in various presentations, is the fact that should people have some decision with respect to some of the conditions they may be faced with that are going to lead eventually to the end of their life, and really it's the care they get up to that point, and really the decisions that they have to make or should be able to make.
Well, yes, the whole idea is that they should be in charge of their own life, so to speak, and the ending of their life, because in the old days, which really wasn't that long ago, there were no decisions to be made because medical care really wasn't very powerful, and so all a good physician could do is come and to your house, hold your hand, and in the midst of your family, you passed away. Mm-hmm. But now we have ever more powerful technology that makes it possible to cheat death, at least temporarily.
I think that one of the main areas is with respect to coronary conditions, because at one time, basically a little bit of nitroglycerin and hopefully that would get you through some attacks, but there was no invasive surgery that was involved. As you just said, you just sort of died at a certain point in time because of congestive heart failure or stroke. And now, well, there's all sorts of life-extending procedures. I myself had a stent put in a number of years ago. A number of friends have had coronary bypasses, and they're still out there alive and kicking. Now, this would not have happened before. But the interesting part about the heart procedures is that they are mostly successful, whereas certain other conditions, say cancer and other diseases, really the outcomes aren't really quite as favorable in many instances. Is that correct?
Well, actually, all things are successful to a certain extent. For example, you've said all the good things that we've done, discovered over the years with heart disease. But ultimately, if your heart gets damaged enough, you end up in heart failure, and you may be readmitted repeatedly to hospital because your lungs are full of fluid, and then gradually you kind of waste away. So although people think of cancer as being the great killer, and whether it's heart disease, your heart giving out, your lung giving out, or your brain when you have dementia, those are all things that ultimately get you. Like 100% of people die eventually.
I've heard that figure.
Yes. None of us carry on forever.
No.
But our technology is more powerful, you're right. Back in the 1960s, the treatment for heart disease, if you had a heart attack, was putting you to bed, giving you some oxygen, and giving you some morphine for pain, and that was it.
We want to talk a little bit later on is with respect to pain management, and also decisions made with respect to end of life, your own individual decisions or family decisions, and also medical decisions, because you as a doctor are really bound to try to keep people alive, isn't that correct?
Well, that's how we're trained.
Yeah.
We're trained to do things. But you really have to look at people from a holistic perspective and apply treatments in the context of the patient. So, for example, there's always the treatment for any particular condition is a specific treatment. But the question comes down that within the setting of a particular patient, what is the best thing to do? And doing the most aggressive treatment in the context of a patient who is near the end of life, you may not be doing the patient a big favor.
Now, some have said, primarily younger people, looking at the total healthcare costs, that older folks really take a lot of money out of the system, because close to end of life, that's where more, I guess, aggressive treatments are often involved, and these aggressive treatments actually cost a fair amount of money.
So just to set it straight, it's really not necessarily an age thing, because there are people who are 89 years old who've run marathons.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
I know there was a 90-year-old gentleman who climbed to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro.
Yeah.
So now, admittedly, as you get older, more things that can happen to you. But it's really your overall health and the number of chronic conditions that you have that's the key to how we should look after you. Now, as far as cost is concerned, there's no question some of the estimates are between 20 and 30% of total healthcare funding is in the last 6 to 12 months of life.
Now, of course, some of us are, I guess you might say, relatively lucky. I've had a couple of friends just this winter in Florida walking on the beach. That was the end, or dying in his sleep. Another instance, another person here in town just took a couple of steps, turned around, and fell over.
Right.
Now, those are relatively low-cost solutions to the healthcare system, really.
Well, that's true. 10% of people die suddenly, but the other 90% of us don't. And one estimate is that the time between before death that you live with some disability is about 14 years.
Is that right? Well, I think it was Woody Allen said that I'm not afraid of dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens. And most of us don't want to be there when it happens. If we are there, we don't want to be terribly much involved in the whole process.
No, you're right. I've had some fainting spells, so I know that all of a sudden passing out, which is, I guess, sort of like that, except you come back, really is not a scary moment.
No.
What really I would not want is what happened to my mother, who had a bad stroke and they lived for 3 years unable to speak and unable to get around on her own. That's scary.
I know my mother-in-law had Alzheimer's, once again, and was not really with it in the real sense for a period of almost 3 years as well, too. So we're not sure how hard that is on them, but we know how hard it is on the family, those of us who are here responsible for care. And I think Shakespeare had something to say about sleep relating it to death as well too. So it's really getting to that point and beyond that's the real concern, and the sort of dichotomy that you have here between the you medical people wanting to keep us alive, and some of us who are ready to go when the point comes where we don't feel that we're really not just contributing, but really not experiencing real quality of life. So this is something that's come up in the media, well, very, very extensively. We look at Quebec, looking at some right to die sort of legislation. I think there's articles just recently we have here. I noticed in the Zoomer magazine, the Zoomer Philosophy, Moses talking about the situation out in British Columbia where trying to keep a lady alive who's otherwise apparently unconscious, but because she responds to the spoon on her lip, indicating substance insertion, maybe that is almost an heroic measure. I think the term is used, right? But how much do we really have to say as individuals as to how do you write? You know, we have the various powers of attorney, decision making that occurs at end of life, but there seems to be a real question there: is how much control do we really have over how we end our lives outside of, you know, taking a gun and shooting ourselves in the head?
Well, at the moment, there has been focus on right to die legislation, the Supreme Court decision in British Columbia that you talked about, and what's going on in Quebec. But I have to say that this is really a small niche of people's concerns, because really people have a lot of control over what's going to happen to them if they would just speak about it. When you develop, say that you're having, I know what's a good example. In America, they've looked at behavior at the end of life with cancer, and in some hospitals across America, take one in Detroit, for example, there's a study done, 50% of people in the last week of life with cancer are admitted to an intensive care unit. Now, in a cancer hospital in New York that specializes in cancer, 9% are admitted. That's a huge difference. So you don't have to be admitted. You have to give consent to have things done to you. That's the law in Ontario.
Right.
So you don't have to consent to being put in an intensive care unit at the end of your life. You can ask for, if you have, with cancer, you often have pain and distress. You can ask for medication to relieve your pain and your distress. And one of the side effects of these drugs is it makes you breathe less, and you may actually speed up your demise. But it's the intention in Ontario, from a legal perspective, and in Canada, if you give drugs to relieve suffering, it's legal. If you give drugs, as the Right to Die movement is talking about, to end that, to bring about death, that's at the moment illegal. And what I've heard from a number of individuals is they want to make sure that they're not going to suffer. So if they know that there's medication available to take care of their suffering, they're okay with that. It's when, but they have to deal with it. They have to discuss that with their physicians. And unfortunately, both the patients and physicians are reluctant to discuss these end-of-life issues.
There's sort of a, I don't know if it's a trial project or a demonstration, I believe, in Nova Scotia, where they looked at patients, giving them these various options, considering that a person was facing a situation of very, very terminal illness, and they had a choice, as you say, of either having some form of treatment for that, even though it was acknowledged that regardless of what treatment you were still going to pass on, or receive some comfort, situational treatment, I guess you might call it, whereby you would be relieved of your pain, and you would then, of course, pass on too. And I know I'm not exactly sure of this, but I understand that in some of the trials that the the patients lived almost equally as long regardless of what decision they made. Is that correct?
Well, that's a particular study that was published that they looked at patients towards the end of their life with cancer, because the physicians believed that these patients would die within 3 months. And they took patients that they into two groups. One group, they actually had communication with us to discussing goals of treatment, whether you want comfort measures as opposed to aggressive care in an intensive care unit. And the other group, they didn't talk to at all. And what they found is that both groups actually ended up living the same length of time, which is interesting, even though you were trying to save them. But the ones who had communication actually ended up being more comfortable, and the cost of care was quite a bit lower.
I guess we shouldn't really talk about cost in situations of life and death, but I know that, I'm not sure what the situation is in Ontario, but I understand in Nova Scotia, healthcare costs are about 43% of their entire provincial budget.
Well, exactly, and right now Nova Scotia is in the news that the nurses went out on a wildcat strike because the patient to nursing ratios, the nurses felt they had to look after too many patients. So on the one hand, you want to say, well, what's the cost of a life? On the other hand, somebody always pays a price, right? So if you figure there's only so much, what's the best way to spend it? Where do you get the most value?
Well, you really have attempted to educate by a number of columns that you've written in the local papers, and also you've done focus groups with individuals to try to determine how they feel. We've worked on various committees as well too, and now as it seems to be that we're reaching maybe a tipping point or a turning point, some sort of watershed with respect to concerns about final care and about health care in general. There's, of course, here in town, the alternate level of care crisis was in the news quite a bit a few years ago, and you were very much involved with that as well. And now I know you're looking forward to dealing with the transitional care, people coming out of the hospital and then moving into either going back to home or moving into nursing home care situations, which is also very important.
That's right. What we were focusing on, the literature shows that actually a small percentage of patients consume the most resources. And the way they do it is by, these folks have multiple chronic conditions, and they keep getting readmitted to hospital. And what they found out is if you focus on these folks, you can organize their care in the community so it's not disjointed. Because say if you have 5 different conditions and all kinds of different folks looking after you, and say you're an older patient and it's kind of hard to get around, and you have disjointed care, you end up with poor care, and then you keep ending up back in hospital. Then if they put you in a hospital bed, then you lose strength, and then when you go back out, you're even worse. So if we could improve their care, which is what this transitional process at the hospital is all about, then it'd be great for patients, because who the heck wants to be readmitted to hospital?
The elderly frail seems to be a term that is applied to these people that not only do they consume a lot of resources, but there's also a cost factor involved. And apparently, unless you're really sort of aggressive with the elderly frail, they can deteriorate fairly rapidly.
For sure. And the worst thing you can do to frail individuals, and by frail I should mean that they can be frail physically, that they have trouble doing the activities of daily living on their own. They need help with it. They help with cooking or going to the bank or getting about in your home, and then cognitively not doing well. In other words, you start to have early dementia, for example. You can't remember exactly where things are, and so these kind of individuals are frail and at high risk of bad things happen to them. These kind of individuals, may fall down, break things. So they need lots of tender, loving care. And then, say they develop cancer, just to use that as an example, and the treatment for the cancer is surgery and removing the cancer, or doing chemotherapy and and giving you these noxious drugs, which are very hard on the body, but may kill the cancer. Well, if you, in a healthy person, terrific. But in a frail individual, you really have to think carefully whether you're going to do them a favor. Are they going to have a miserable life after removing the cancer, or would they do better if you ignored the cancer and just optimized their life for whatever amount of time that they have left?
Now, with these decisions are very important decisions. Where should the process start for individuals? With their own doctor, or?
Well, yeah, I would think the best person to talk to would be actually your doctor. And the problem comes down is that patients are loath to do it. You have powers of attorney there, advance directives. Only about 10 or 20% of the population actually has that. So the majority of people don't. And then doctors themselves are uncomfortable talking about these things. So then you have a communication failure. And if you don't know how sick you are, and you don't know how frail you are, and nobody talks to you about it, how do you make a plan?
And then when you're actually in the hospital and decisions have to be made within a relatively short period of time, that is a lot of pressure not only on the individual but on the family as well.
Oh yeah, like in the middle of a crisis, it's very hard to do the decision.
Yeah.
So really, you should talk, hopefully you have a family doctor, and it must be said that not everyone has one, but hopefully you do. Get as much information about yourself as you can. Actually find out what the state of your health is, what the doctor would recommend for you, and then sit down with your family and come up with a plan when things are not in a crisis. So if you're having early dementia and it's going to get worse, or your heart is really bad and you've been in and out of hospital a few times, those are the times to actually sit down. Or you do have early cancer, sit down and decide, what the heck should I be doing?
Yeah. Well, Health Sciences North is putting more emphasis on the older population now. Special services if you're in the emergency, if you're past a certain age, there seems to be extra care. There's a unit at the old memorial site for those who don't have a physician, that they receive analysis of their condition. And it seems like more of that really does need to be required or is necessary, even from the family physician point of view.
Yeah, I think we're at the beginning of a total change of thinking. Like this whole business of frailty is a relatively new concept. We traditionally, from a medically, we've been taught to look at patients as a collection of diseases. And now we're looking at them holistically as to how they function. And that's a new approach. And the things that you've brought up about the hospital, this is a new approach. The Medicare was designed in the 1950s as to treat acute diseases. But then population of Canada was quite old. The life expectancy was, in the 60s.
That's right.
And we mostly had acute diseases. And now we're living 50 years later or 60 years later in midst of the average 75-year-old has 5 chronic diseases, and the average person dies at 82. And so we're living with a lot of chronic diseases which need to be treated in the community, but most of the money that's invested in health, and you said in Nova Scotia it's 43%, and Nova Scotia is having trouble meeting their budget. Most of the money is still going into hospital care and not into the community care.
And of course, most individuals really do want to be at home, or if not at home, in more comfortable surroundings than a hospital, even though the hospital is trying their best to accommodate, but of course with fewer beds than we've had before. And as you mentioned, people over 75 having some 5 chronic conditions.
That's the average.
That's rather, and of course as you grow older, and the amount of prescription drugs that are taken as well too, and the general aging of the population, this is an age wave that's going to have
it's got 30 years to go.
Yes, and a rather profound effect. Some of us aren't going to make it to the end of that 30 years, And of course, the age wave is not coming at shore all at once. It's sort of over a period of time. But nevertheless, it is going to put quite a strain on
Oh,
the
for
system.
sure. And then don't forget technology, because just like you talked about stents and open heart surgery, we didn't have that in the 1960s. So all these things are wonderful because they do provide a wonderful extra benefit to people, that they can have quality of life. But and there's going to be more and more coming. So how do you use all these wonderful technologies wisely? And what we had Andre Picard up in Sudbury presenting to health leaders earlier, and just recently actually. And I heard him speak. He's a health columnist for the Globe and Mail.
Oh, yes.
He's written a recent book. He sounded actually very intelligent. And he said, what we really have to do is, and he talked about money. He said, talking about governments, pay for what has value and don't pay for things that don't have value.
Well, you mentioned quality of life. So here we have, a lot of us have different definitions for quality of life, but certain family members may feel that, okay, there's John, he's not in very good shape, he's got dementia, he can't move around very much, but he's there in the corner, and we want to keep him alive anyway because it's, he's been around for a few years, and occasionally he may show some signs of consciousness. And
that's right.
And but John may feel, hey, I've had enough, I've had a good life, I want to go. So is this where such things like advance directives come in, and other sort of measures that you have some control over what care you get and when you go, as it were?
I think that's a wonderful idea. Hopefully, you have a family who loves you, cares for you, and knows what you want, and that's the best. So if you have one of those kind of families, you're all set. As long as you've discussed what you want.
So you got to talk about it.
You've got to talk about it so they know,
right.
And then they don't have the guilt or the issues of trying to decide what to do for you because you never said anything.
Yeah.
So if you have a caring family, sit down and talk. Now, as you know, unfortunately, not everyone has a caring family, and more often, the family may be in Vancouver and you're living in Sudbury, and then becomes kind of problematic. But from a legal perspective, anyone can be a substitute decision maker. So a friend qualifies. So if you have a friend and you don't have a family, sit down with the friend. And I think it's wise to have advance directives, to have it all written down. I think that's a good idea. But the key to all these things is actually thinking about it first.
Well, I think that, of course, it's like wills. A lot of folks don't like to think about making up a will because that's an admission that you're not going to be around eventually.
I guess so.
But, of course, the various powers of attorney, these are available at the MP's office and also on the Internet. And, it's something that probably people should begin to think about sooner rather than later.
Oh, for sure. There's one for financial things and one for health things, and you really should think about it. But there's this, what you just said, this denial thing, and that's why the vast majority of people don't have advance directives. But because there's such great interest now in end-of-life issues, and it's starting to be talked about, I hope that's going to change.
Well, we're just about out of time. Is there anything that people who want more information, how should they get it? Is there a spot they can turn to? I know the CARP organization in town is very much involved. Our website, Friendly to Seniors, has information on where you can go. And of course, your columns will continue to be published. And Health Scientists North is holding seminars as well too. So there is information out there. It's possible to get it.
Right. And then the most recent Northern Life column is all about our hospice. And there's some references in that article where you can get information. You can contact our local CCAC about the hospice. You can call the hospice yourself. And really, if you think about these things and you are interested in not suffering at the end of life, really, you don't really have to worry so much about the dying with dignity, because the hospice is a wonderful place,
That's true.
and
Yeah.
you can now have the ability to actually die at home, which is what the majority of people
That's
want
right.
to do.
Yeah. And that's our time. I want to thank Dr. Peter Zalan for being with us here, and our opinions, which are really the opinions, I think, of a lot of folks nowadays. And until next time, goodbye for now.